In this video we will explore the life on board a World War II battleship. We will be following Private First Class Thomas Aldrich Morrow as he survives the dangers of the ocean and naval life. If you like these videos, please leave a like and/or subscribe. But for now, sit back, relax and enjoy the story. The first thing you learn about the sea is that it does not care about you. Not in the way a storm cares, not with any malice or intention. It simply does not know you are there. It was turning and breathing and swallowing ships long before your grandfather's grandfather was born, and it will go on doing so long after every name carved into every memorial has been worn smooth by rain. The Pacific Ocean is not your enemy. It is something far more indifferent than that. And there is a strange comfort in that, once you learn to feel it. Private First Class Thomas Aldrich Morrow. Tommy, to the men who liked him, Morrow to those who respected him, and both to those who knew him well, had been aboard the USS Indiana for 6 weeks when he first truly understood the sea. He was 22 years old. He was from Decatur, Illinois. He had never seen the ocean before the Navy. The Indiana was a South Dakota-class battleship, 680 feet of gray steel and purpose. She displaced 35,000 tons. She carried 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, guns that could throw a shell the weight of a small automobile 20 miles across open water. She had anti-aircraft batteries bristling from every elevated surface like iron thorns. She had a crew of nearly 1,900 men, and on most mornings Tommy could walk from his bunk to the mess hall and back without seeing a single face he recognized, which he found both lonely and quietly remarkable. He worked in damage control. His job, in plain terms, was to keep the ship from dying when things went wrong. He knew where every fire hose was stored on decks 3 through 6. He knew the location of every watertight hatch in his section. He knew the difference between a Class A fire and a Class B fire, and he knew that the difference mattered, and he had practiced putting out both kinds in training until the actions lived in his hands rather than his head. He was good at his job. He was also terrified of it, which his supervisor, Chief Petty Officer Randlebeck, told him was the correct way to feel. Confidence without fear gets men killed, Beck had said, on one of the early mornings when the two of them were checking equipment by lamplight. Fear without confidence gets men killed too. But you keep both of them in the same room together, keep them looking at each other, and that's when a man gets useful. Tommy had written that down in the small green notebook he kept in his breast pocket. He wrote a lot of things down. It was a habit from before the war, from a boyhood in which books were a kind of shelter, and it had followed him aboard without asking permission. Tonight, and it is night now, deep night, the kind with no moon and no stars because the clouds have eaten everything. Tommy is standing at the stern of the ship on a brief rotation above decks, 10 minutes of cold air before he returns below to the warmth and noise and close smell of the lower compartments. He is wearing his pea coat. His hands are in his pockets. The wake of the ship spreads out behind him in 2 long white lines that glow faintly in the dark, phosphorescence stirred up by the screws, and he watches it for a while without thinking much at all, which is rare, and which he is grateful for. The sea tonight is what the older sailors call a long swell. There are no breaking waves, no whitecaps, just these slow and enormous hills of water that the Indiana rides up and over, a rhythm so deep and gradual that you feel it more in the chest than in the feet. A breathing, the ship breathing, or something breathing beneath the ship. It is difficult not to think of it in those terms, out here in the dark. The wind comes from the northwest and it is cold and it smells of nothing but salt and distance. Tommy thinks of his mother's kitchen. He does this often, not because he is particularly homesick, or rather, not only because of that, but because the mind, when given darkness and motion and no immediate task, tends to go somewhere warm. Her kitchen smelled of coffee and old wood, and the particular sweetness of the fig preserves she kept on the second shelf. There was a radio on the counter that got 3 stations clearly and 2 more if you tilted the antenna to the left and held it there. His father had fixed the linoleum twice and it still lifted at the corner near the back door. He wonders if it still lifts. He wonders if anyone has fixed it. He wonders if his mother stands at the window in the evening, the way she used to, looking out at the street while the light changed. He does not let himself wonder too long. That way is not useful. Below decks, the Indiana is never quiet. This is one of the things that surprised him most in those first disorienting weeks, the noise. Not loud, not usually, but constant. The engines, deep in the hull, produce a vibration more felt than heard, a low-frequency hum that you stop noticing after a while in the same way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. But it is always there. And over that, the creak and tick of metal expanding and contracting, the rush of water through pipes, the distant clang of something being shifted in a compartment 2 levels down, voices through ventilation ducts, the PA system crackling before announcements, the sound of cards being placed on a mess table, boots on steel grating. A battleship is a city that moves, a city that, in certain lights and circumstances, you can almost love. Almost. Tommy leaves the stern and walks back along the port side, keeping one hand on the safety rail. The deck is wet with spray, and slightly tilted. They are in a long, slow turn. He can feel it and he walks carefully, not from fear but from habit. You learn to be careful on wet steel. It teaches you the first time, and after that you remember. Through a hatch, down a ladder, and the warmth hits him like a wall. The smell of fuel oil and food and men. The light yellow and constant, no variation for time of day. He passes through the compartment where Petty Officer Dennis Reyes is sitting on his bunk writing a letter, and Reyes lifts a hand without looking up, and Tommy lifts a hand back. He passes the small alcove where 3 men are sleeping in rotation, their breathing slow and synchronized in a way that always strikes Tommy as peaceful, like animals in winter. He reaches his own bunk, the middle of 3, and sits on the edge and removes his boots. His notebook is in his pocket. He opens it to a fresh page. He writes, Day 43. Long swell. Phosphorescence in the wake. Cold. Decatur cold, not Pacific cold. Heading southwest still. Don't know what's coming. He pauses. He adds, Beck says we'll know soon enough. He closes the notebook. He lies back. Above him, the underside of the top bunk is 3 inches from his face, and he has mapped every scratch and stain and welded seam of it over 43 nights, and it is, in its way, as familiar as any ceiling he has ever had. The engines hum. The ship breathes. Tommy Morrow closes his eyes. There is a kind of man who, when placed inside a machine, becomes more himself. Not less, not ground down into a cog, not made anonymous by the uniform and the routine and the 1,000 small surrenders that military life requires, but more, as though the structure, the constraint, the absolute predictability of what must happen next gives him room inside himself that he did not have before. Room to notice. Room to feel things slowly. Room to be quiet in a way that civilian life, with all its choices and noise and open horizons, never quite allowed. Tommy Morrow was this kind of man, though he would not have said so himself. He would have said he was just getting on with it. He would have said most men were the same. But Reyes, who watched people the way some men watched weather, had said to him once, You're the only man I know who looks more rested after a watch than before it. And Tommy had not known what to do with that. So he had said nothing, which Reyes seemed to take as confirmation. Reveille on the Indiana came at 0530. Not a bugle that was not the Navy's way but the PA system, a crackling tone, and then a voice, always the same voice in those weeks, belonging to a boatswain's mate named Hollis who had the particular gift of sounding both civil and utterly non-negotiable. Reveille, Reveille. All hands heave out and trice up. Reveille. The compartment shifted. You could feel it before you could see it, a change in the quality of the dock, a collective exhale, the soft percussion of men sitting up in bunks, feet finding the cold steel deck. Tommy was usually already awake by then. He had been a light sleeper since boyhood, and the sea had not changed that. He lay in the last minute or two before the call, listening to the ship, cataloging sounds the way he used to catalog birds from his bedroom window at home, not with any scientific purpose, just the pleasure of distinguishing one thing from another, of knowing what he was hearing. The particular knock of a loose-fitting 2 compartments forward. The change in engine pitch that meant they had altered speed slightly in the night. The sound of someone, always someone, already moving in the dark before the call came. Some soul even less able to sleep than Tommy. When Hollis spoke, Tommy was already sitting up. The morning routine on a battleship is a ritual, and like all rituals, it is partly practical and partly something else. Something that has to do with order in the face of chaos. Something that has to do with the comfort of sequence when everything outside the hull is formless and vast and indifferent. Tommy dressed in the same order every morning. Undershirt first, then the chambray shirt, the dungaree trousers, both issued, both washed until the blue had gone pale at the knees and elbows. Socks wool, which he was grateful for, because the deck was always cold, and then his boots, which he laced left first, always, a habit so old he could not have said where it came from. His peacoat went on the hook by his bunk during the day. His notebook went into his breast pocket. His watch, his father's watch, a Hamilton with a cracked crystal that kept perfect time, went on his left wrist. That was the order. That was every morning. He had not missed it once in 4 days. The bathroom, in civilian language, was a long narrow compartment with a row of sinks along one bulkhead and stalls along the other, and in the morning it held 15 or 20 men in various stages of waking, and the noise of it was the noise of men being human, water running, someone coughing deeply, a brief and half-hearted argument about something that had happened the night before, the sound of a razor on skin. Tommy shaved every morning. Some men didn't bother, or let it go to 2 or 3 days, but Tommy found that the act of shaving, the small cold shock of water, the careful attention required, the clean feeling after, was one of the better moments of the day. It demanded just enough focus to clear the mind of whatever had collected overnight, and it left him feeling, briefly, like a man with choices. He stood at the sink next to Petty Officer Second Class Aurelio Vasquez, who was from Albuquerque, and who was shaving with the focused gravity of a man diffusing something. Vasquez had been on ships for 4 years. He had been at Pearl. He did not talk about Pearl, which Tommy respected, but you could sometimes see it in him, not in his face, which was usually calm, but in the way his eyes moved in certain situations, quickly and without announcement, checking and cataloging, always noting the exits. Sleep? Tommy asked, which was the full extent of their usual morning exchange. Enough, Vasquez said, which was his usual answer. This constituted, between them, a warm and functional friendship. Breakfast was served in 2 sittings, and Tommy went to the first, which meant 0615. Which meant the food was hot and the compartment was not yet crowded. The mess hall on a battleship is not a place of beauty. It is long and low-ceilinged, lit by fluorescent tubes that hum faintly at a frequency just above hearing, lined with metal tables bolted to the deck and benches bolted to the tables. The trays are metal. The cups are metal. Everything is metal, or near enough. But the food, and this still surprised Tommy. Even at 6 weeks the food was often genuinely good. That morning it was powdered eggs, which he had made his peace with, and salt pork, and toast that was just short of burnt, which he preferred, and coffee so dark and strong it was less a beverage than a decision. He ate deliberately, not quickly,
the way Chief Beck had once recommended for reasons that were half practical and half philosophical. "Eat like you've got time," Beck had said. "Even when you don't. Especially when you don't. Your body doesn't know the difference between a man with time and a man without it. It just knows whether it was fed properly." Tommy ate like he had time. Across from him was Seaman Gideon Marsh, 20 years old, from a small town in Georgia whose name Tommy had heard 3 times and still couldn't hold in his memory. Marsh was large and fair-haired and possessed of an almost supernatural cheerfulness that, in the first week, Tommy had assumed was performance, and in the second week had come to understand was simply how Marsh was made. Marsh was eating with considerable enthusiasm. "Eggs are better today," he said. "They are the same," Tommy said. "You've got to approach them with the right attitude," Marsh said, without irony. Tommy drank his coffee. Outside, though there were no windows here, no way of knowing except by time the sun would be coming up over the Pacific. Gray light on gray water. The long swell continuing. At 0700 Tommy reported for morning quarters, which was the daily muster, all hands to their stations, attendance taken, the ship accounting for itself. His section assembled on the port side amidships, 16 men in 2 lines, and Chief Beck walked the line with his clipboard and said each name and each man said here, and then they stood for a moment in the particular silence that follows a roll call, which is the silence of men who have confirmed that all of them are still present, still accounted for, still themselves. Beck was 51 years old and had served on 4 ships. He was short and broad and had hands like geology. His face was the color and texture of old teak, not from any single sun, but from 20 years of accumulated weather, and when he looked at you directly you had the impression of being assessed not just as a person, but as a piece of equipment, calmly and without malice, for what you were worth and what you might withstand. After quarters came the morning inspection of equipment. Tommy's responsibility that morning was the fire suppression system in compartments 3C through 3F4 spaces, 12 nozzle heads, 2 main valves, 2 backup valves. He checked each one, tested the pressure, logged the readings. The work was repetitive in a way that he had come to find not tedious but meditative. He was checking the second valve in 3D when Beck appeared in the hatchway behind him. "Morrow, Chief." Beck stepped into the compartment. He looked at the valve, then at Tommy's logbook, then at Tommy. "You hear the scuttlebutt this morning." Scuttlebutt was a word for rumor aboard ship, which Tommy had always found poetically appropriate. The scuttlebutt was originally the cask of drinking water where men gathered and talked, and gossip moved like water, fast and finding every low place. "No, Chief." Beck was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bulkhead, as though reading something printed there. "Word from the execs yeoman is we've changed heading in the night. South by southwest now." Tommy waited.
"That puts us," Beck said, still looking at the bulkhead, "somewhere interesting. In about 4 days." Tommy held the logbook. The valve dripped once, quietly. "How interesting?" he asked. Beck looked at him then. The assessment look. Calibrating not fear, but readiness. "The kind that gets written about," he said. And then he left, and Tommy stood in the compartment alone with the hum of the ship and the faint smell of oil and seawater and the weight of something that had not yet arrived but was now, unmistakably, on its way. He opened his notebook. He wrote, "Day 44. Changed heading in the night. South by southwest. Beck says 4 days. He didn't say 4 days to what?" He paused. He added, "Eggs were the same as always." Marsh disagreed. He put the notebook away. He returned to the valve. He finished his inspection. The ship moved south by southwest, through water that did not know or care where it was going, carrying its 1,900 souls and its miles of steel corridor and its terrible guns toward whatever the ocean was keeping, just beyond the curve of the visible world. There are men who can read weather the way others read print. Not with instruments, not with charts, though the Indiana had both, and the meteorological officer consulted them religiously every morning in a small compartment near the bridge that smelled of pencil shavings and cigarette smoke. But there are men, usually older men who have spent enough consecutive years outdoors that the atmosphere has become a kind of language to them, who simply know, who feel the change in pressure at the back of the sinuses before any dial records it, who notice the color of the horizon at 0600 and understand, without having to reason it through, what that color is promising. Chief Beck was one of these men. Tommy had first noticed it 4 days ago, when Beck paused during an equipment check and stood for a moment in the hatchway that opened onto the main deck, not doing anything, just standing, with his head slightly raised and his eyes moving slowly across the sky to the northwest. He stood there for perhaps 15 seconds. Then he stepped back inside and said, without particular emphasis, "Batten, what's yours?" Tommy had not known, then, what that meant in terms of weather. He had thought it might be standard procedure, something on a schedule he hadn't seen. Now, at day 46, he understood. The sky that morning had changed color. It was not a dramatic change, no sudden bruising, no towers of cloud building on the horizon the way they did in films and paintings. It was subtler than that. The blue had gone slightly wrong, pale in the wrong places, and with a yellowish cast near the horizon that the older sailors called sick light, which Tommy thought was exactly right, because it looked the way a man looks in the first hour of a fever present, mostly normal, but with something behind the eyes that tells you what's coming. The swell had changed, too. Over the past 18 hours it had lengthened, each wave bigger now, more widely spaced, rolling up from somewhere far away to the northwest where whatever was generating them had not yet arrived. The Indiana rode them differently. Not worse, not yet, but differently, a longer, slower pitch, but rising more gradually and falling more deliberately, as though the ship itself was beginning to pay attention. Tommy stood on deck at 0545, before quarters, in the last minutes of his above-deck ration, and watched the horizon. Vasquez appeared beside him, as Vasquez sometimes did, without announcement. They stood together. The wind had picked up since yesterday, not dramatically, but steadily, the kind of increase that doesn't alarm you in any single moment, but which, when you stop and think about where it was 12 hours ago, is revelatory. Northwest, Vasquez said. How long? Tommy asked. Vasquez looked at the horizon for another moment. He had been at sea 4 years. He had been through 2 serious storms in the Pacific and 1 in the North Atlantic, which he described, on the single occasion he described it at all, simply as educational. Tonight, Vasquez said. Maybe sooner. He went back inside. Tommy stayed another 2 minutes, watching the sick light move along the horizon. Then he went in as well. The preparation for a storm on a battleship is a thing of considerable and specific beauty if you know what you are looking at. It is not frantic. That is the first thing. There is no running, no shouting, no visible panic of any kind, because panic on a ship at sea is a luxury that cannot be afforded, and besides, these men have done this before, most of them, and the ones who haven't have been trained until the training lives in the body rather than the mind, which is the only place training is any use when the moment comes. What it looks like, instead, is a kind of deliberate acceleration. The ordinary tempo of shipboard life, already purposeful, already structured, shifts up a register. Men move with slightly more intention. Conversations become shorter and more specific. Tools are checked and stowed. Anything that can move is secured against movement. Hatches that are usually left dogged open are checked and closed. Chief Beck moved through the section like a slow tide, stopping at each man, saying little, seeing everything. To Marsh, that locker. Close it right or don't close it. To a young seaman named Pritchard who was new enough that his boots still looked like boots, "Where's your line? Never go above decks without your line in weather. Never. Say it back to me." To Tommy, stopping beside him while Tommy was securing the last of the equipment lockers in 3C, "You know what a sea anchor is?" "Yes, Chief. Drag device. Slows the stern in heavy following seas." "Good. We won't need it. But it pleases me that you know." And then he was gone, moving aft, his clipboard under his arm, his extraordinary face entirely calm. By 1,000 hours the wind was serious. This is the honest word for it, not dangerous, not yet, but serious. The kind of wind that makes you think about it. That pushes back when you open a hatch. That takes spray off the tops of the swells, which were larger now, noticeably larger, each one a slow gray hill that the Indiana climbed and descended with a motion that had moved from meditative to something more demanding. Tommy was below decks, where most of the crew spent most of a storm, and he was doing what the crew did in the hours before a storm became fully itself, working, checking, moving through the motions of preparedness with a steadiness that was part training and part something harder to name, a collective decision, made wordlessly by 1,900 men, to be ready. In the mess hall at 1,100, the tables were not unusually full. Some men ate early before the motion got bad. Some men didn't eat at all and didn't discuss why. Tommy ate not because he was particularly hungry, but because Beck had said to eat when you could, and because the act of eating was itself a form of steadiness, a signal to the body that things were normal enough for food. Marsh ate with the enthusiasm of a man who had not received the weather briefing, or had received it and decided it was not relevant to lunch. "What do you think," Marsh said, "about the potatoes today?" "I think they are potatoes," Tommy said. "They are better than yesterday's." "You said that yesterday." "Yesterday I was right too," Marsh said, with complete sincerity, and returned to his tray. Across the table, a man named Elwood Fitch, machinist mate, 3rd class, from somewhere in Ohio, quiet in the particular way of men who spent their working days listening to engines, was sitting with his coffee held in both hands and his eyes on the middle distance. He wasn't eating. He was watching something that wasn't in the room. Tommy did not ask. On a ship you learned which silences to respect. After a moment Fitch said, to no one specifically, "Reminds me of the Coral Sea." Nobody asked him to say more. Nobody needed to. By 1400 the storm had arrived. Not all at once, weather rarely does, despite how memory tends to compress it. It arrived the way the sea always does things, gradually, then completely. There was a period, lasting perhaps an hour, where you could still tell yourself it was bad but manageable, where the ship's motion was demanding but not frightening, where the sounds were unfamiliar but explicable. And then, somewhere in the middle of that hour, the line was crossed, and you were in it. The Indiana moved differently in heavy weather. This was the thing that struck Tommy most, and that he had not been prepared for by training or description. A ship of this size, 35,000 tons, 680 feet, built for war, built for punishment, moved in a storm like something alive and uncomfortable. The roll was deep and slow, not violent, not the sharp lurching of a small boat, but this profound and almost geological tipping, 15 degrees to port, then back through center, then 15 to starboard, over and over, so that everything in the world, the overhead, the bulkheads, the deck you were standing on, became temporarily unreliable. You walked with your hands out. You sat with your feet braced. You learned very quickly which handhold was near which station, and you stopped moving anywhere without knowing where the next one was. The sound changed too. The baseline hum of the engines was still there, underneath everything. But over it now came the sea itself, not as something heard from outside, but as something the ship was part of, so that the groan of the hull in a heavy swell was the ship speaking in a register below language, saying, "I am working. I am holding. I will hold." Tommy believed it. He had been told, by men who knew, that a South Dakota-class battleship could survive seas that would end most things. He held on to this the way you hold on to facts in the dark, not because they make the dark smaller, but because they give the hand something to grip. He was in compartment 3E when the first really heavy roll came. 40 degrees, maybe more. The deck tilted to starboard like a slow decision being made. The locker door he had been checking swung open despite its latch, and he caught it with one hand while his other found the pipe along the overhead, and he held there for a moment, suspended, almost horizontal, one hand above and one hand to the side while the ship considered whether this was as far as it meant to go. It came back. Always it came back. He dogged the locker properly and stood with both hands on the pipe for a moment, breathing. His heart was going faster than he would have liked. His body had an opinion about the last 30 seconds that differed from his mind's assessment of the situation, and he let the two of them have their disagreement in private while he waited for his hands to steady. "You good?" Vasquez, in the hatchway, watching with those quick eyes. "Good," Tommy said. Vasquez nodded. Not a smile, exactly, but something in the vicinity of one. He understood about the body having opinions. He had seen worse than this, and the seeing had not made him immune, but had given him a longer view. "Another few hours," Vasquez said, "then it drops." "How do you know?" "Because it always does." He moved off down the corridor, braced and easy, walking the tilting deck the way Tommy was only beginning to learn, not fighting it, not compensating for it, but moving with it, reading each roll a half-second ahead and letting the ship's own motion carry him. Tommy made a note of this. He would practice. The storm was at its height between 1,600 and 2,000 hours. During those 4 hours Tommy did his work. He moved through his section, checking, logging, securing, speaking to the men he needed to speak to, being present. This was what damage control meant in heavy weather, when there was no damage yet it meant presence. It meant moving through the spaces that were your responsibility, and being a thing that held steady so that the space itself held steady. He found, not as frightened as he had expected to be. He was frightened. That was honest. But it was a clean fear, a useful fear, the kind that sharpened the eyes and kept the hands careful, not the kind that locked the muscles and clouded the mind. Beck's fear, held in the same room as something else. At 18:30 he passed the small alcove where the 3 sleeping men had been that morning. The schedule had rotated, and now Marsh was there, somehow asleep through everything, his large fair face entirely peaceful, one arm hanging off the bunk, the ship rolling around him like weather around a stone. Tommy stopped for a moment and looked at him. He thought, some people are just built for this. He thought, I'm going to try to be one of them. The storm broke sometime after midnight. Tommy was off watch by then, lying in his bunk, not sleeping but resting, feeling the motion of the ship gradually ease, the rolls becoming shorter, the interval between them lengthening, the sound of the sea against the hull softening from argument to conversation to, finally, something almost quiet. He lay in the dark and listened to the ship finding itself again. He thought about the 4 days Beck had mentioned. 3 now. He thought about the phrase, the kind that gets written about. He opened his notebook in the dark, by feel, to a fresh page. He found the pen in his pocket. He could not see what he was writing, but he wrote it anyway, by the shape of the letters in his hands. Day 46. Storm. Held. 3 days. He closed the notebook. The ship moved through the dark water, south by southwest, toward whatever was coming. The engines hummed. The sea said nothing. Tommy slept. There is a particular quality to waiting that soldiers and sailors know and civilians rarely do. Not the ordinary waiting of a delayed train or doctor's office. That waiting is merely inconvenient, and the mind passes through it easily, distracted by small things, barely aware of its own passage. This is different. This is waiting when you know that what is coming will require everything you have, and you do not yet know if everything you have will be enough. This kind of waiting has weight. It presses on the chest gently but without pause, like a hand that never lifts. And the men who survive it well are the men who have learned by instinct or by practice or by the hard instruction of experience to carry the weight without letting it carry them. Tommy Morrow had never waited for battle before. He was learning how. Day 47 began with the same voice, the same call, the same cold deck under his feet. Reveille. Quarters. Inspection. Coffee so dark it was nearly a solid. Marsh finding something to appreciate about the breakfast that no one else had noticed. But the texture of the day was different. It was difficult to say exactly how nothing had been announced. No orders had come down through official channels. No officer had gathered the men and explained the situation. The Navy did not, in Tommy's experience, operate that way. Information descended by rank, filtered and rationed, arriving at the level of the ordinary seaman in fragments and implications, and the silences between things said. But the ship knew. A ship of 1,900 men is a kind of organism, and information moves through it by processes that have nothing to do with the official chain of command. A yeoman says something to a cook. A radioman is seen coming off a long watch with a particular expression. An officer pauses in a corridor and looks at nothing for a moment too long. These are signals, and the men who read them, who have been living at close quarters long enough to have calibrated their instruments, read them accurately. The ship knew something was coming, and so the days had a different quality now. Still the same structure, still the same routines, still the same sequence of work and watch and rest. But underneath the ordinary surface of things, a current had begun to move. Tommy felt it first in the mess hall. Conversation had changed. Not gone quiet men still talked, still argued about cards and baseball and the relative merits of various stateside cities, still told the same stories that had been told enough times that everyone knew the endings and laughed anyway. But there were more pauses than usual. Moments where a table went briefly silent, where a man looked into his coffee cup as though reading something there, where the laughter, when it came, was perhaps a quarter-second slower than it had been a week ago. He felt it in the work, too. The inspections were more thorough. Not ordered to be, nobody had issued a directive, but the men ran their checks more carefully, handled equipment with slightly more attention, logged their readings with a neatness that spoke of men who understood, without being told, that the time for approximate was passing. And he felt it in the evenings. The evenings were when it was most apparent. After the last watch rotation, after the mess hall had cleared, in the hour or two before lights out, when the men had time that was technically their own, this was when the current beneath the surface became most visible. Men wrote letters. Many men. More letters, Tommy noticed, than any previous evening, and the writing of them was quieter and more deliberate than the casual correspondence of ordinary weeks. Men sat alone in ways they hadn't before. Men found each other in pairs and spoke in low voices about things that stayed between them. Fitch, the machinist's mate, spent an evening carefully disassembling and cleaning a pocket watch that Tommy had never seen him remove from his pocket before. He worked at it for 2 hours at the mess table, alone, with the concentration of a man doing something that mattered. Tommy asked him, the next morning, if the watch had been giving him trouble. No, Fitch said. It keeps perfect time. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. On the evening of the first day, Tommy wrote a letter home. He had written letters regularly throughout, short ones, careful ones. shaped by the knowledge that they would be read by a censor before they were sent, and so could not contain certain things, could not reference location or movement or anything that might give the enemy information, which meant they could not contain most of what his days actually consisted of. He had become skilled at writing around the truth, not lying exactly, but constructing a version of things from the parts that were permissible, the way a sculptor works with what the stone allows. But this letter was different from the ones before it. He sat at the mess table with his paper and his pen, and for a long while he did not write anything. He thought about his mother. He thought about his father, who was a quiet man in the way of men who have thought about things long enough to have stopped needing to explain them, who had stood on the platform at the station in Decatur and gripped Tommy's hand and said, "You know what you are." And Tommy had nodded, though he had not been entirely sure what his father meant, whether it was a statement about character or profession, or something older and less nameable. He had held onto it regardless. "Dear Mom," he wrote, eventually, "the Pacific is very large. I don't think I understood that before I was in it. You can go days without seeing anything that isn't water, which sounds lonely and mostly isn't. I am well. I am eating. The coffee here would take the finish off Dad's workbench, but I have developed an appreciation for it." He paused. He thought about what he wanted to say that was true and permissible. "I have been thinking about the kitchen," he wrote. "The corner of the linoleum by the back door. I hope someone has fixed it. I hope you are well. I hope the summer comes early to Decatur this year. I think about the yacht in June." Another pause. The pen resting on the paper. "I want you to know that I am careful. I want you to know that the men here are good men and I trust them. I want you to know that whatever happens, I have been proud to be here, which I did not expect to feel and cannot entirely explain, but it is true." He stopped. "Read it back." "Changed nothing. Your Tommy." He folded it and addressed it and put it with the outgoing mail and did not think about it again, because the thinking about it part was done, and what came after was something else. On the second day, Beck called the section together. Not formally, not at quarters, not with any official designation. He simply appeared in the compartment where most of them happened to be after the morning inspection and stood with his hands at his sides and looked at them for a moment before speaking, the way he always did. This habit of looking before talking that Tommy had come to understand was not hesitation, but courtesy, the courtesy of a man who wanted to see the people he was speaking to before he chose his words. "I'm going to tell you what I know," he said, "which isn't as much as you'd like and more than some of you will want." Nobody moved. "We're heading toward an engagement. The specifics aren't mine to give you. What I can tell you is that it will involve surface action, which means our guns and their guns, which means noise and smoke and the probability of damage." He let that sit for a moment. Damage control and surface action is the difference between a ship that stays fighting and a ship that doesn't. You know your sections. You know your systems. I have watched every one of you for 6 weeks, and I am telling you now, as plainly as I know how, that I am not worried. I am not worried about this section. He said this without performance, without the theatrical confidence of a speech. He said it the way he said everything, as simple information, delivered to men he considered capable of receiving it. "Questions," he said. "Not do you have questions. Just the word, offered like a tool." Marsh said, "Are we going to win?" Several men looked at him. Marsh looked back with the pure, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who found the question reasonable. Beck looked at Marsh for a moment. "That," he said, "is above my pay grade, son. But I'll tell you this, I've never been on a ship that decided to lose, and I don't intend to start now." He left. The men stood for a moment in the space where he had been. Then they went back to work, because that was what there was to do, and doing it was the only answer to the question that any of them actually had the power to give. The third day was the quietest. Not in terms of sound, the ship was no quieter than any other day, the engines and the sea and the thousand small noises of 1,900 lives continuing. But quiet in another sense. A particular stillness had settled over the men like weather, a stillness that was not despair, and was not resignation, but was something older than either. The stillness of people who have done what preparation allows and have arrived, finally, at the place where preparation ends and something else begins. Tommy spent much of it with Vasquez. They were not working, they were on a rest rotation, both of them, a deliberate pause built into the schedule for the hours before action, and they sat in the compartment with their backs against the bulkhead and their legs out in front of them and said very little. Tommy had his notebook but did not write in it. Vasquez had a rosary that he turned slowly in his hands, not praying, or at least not visibly praying, just the movement of the beads, the small regularity of it. After a long while Vasquez said, "First time." "Yes," Tommy said. Vasquez nodded slowly. "It's loud," he said. "More than you think. Keep that in your head. Whatever you've imagined, it's louder. Don't let the sound confuse you. The sound is just sound. Your job is still your job." Tommy held this. "Did it help you, knowing that, the first time?" Vasquez considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he said, "but it might help you." Tommy almost laughed. He felt the laugh move through him, unexpected and genuine. And he let it out quietly, not a big laugh, just a small release of something that had been held too long. Vasquez's mouth moved. Almost a smile. Almost. They sat in silence for another hour. The beads moved. The ship moved. The third day turned slowly toward its end. At 2,200 hours, in the dim and quiet of the lower decks, Tommy lay in his bunk and looked at the underside of the bunk above him and listened to the ship. He had come to know its voice, its rhythms, the particular way it held itself against the sea. He thought about the letter he had written, about his mother reading it in the kitchen in Decatur, maybe standing at the window, about the linoleum corner, about June in the yard. He thought about Beck's face when he said, "I am not worried about this section," about the exact quality of his voice on those words, which was the quality of something true. He thought about Vasquez's beads turning in the dim light. He opened his notebook. He wrote, "Day 49. Last night of waiting. 3 days gone. The men are steady. I think I am steady. I am going to try to sleep." He paused. He wrote one more line. "Whatever comes tomorrow, I have been here. I have been present. I think that matters, even if I can't explain why." He put the notebook in his breast pocket. He closed his eyes. Around him the ship breathed and hummed and moved through the dark water, carrying its 1,900 souls toward the morning. And the morning was coming whether they were ready or not. And somewhere in the deep and particular exhaustion of 3 days of waiting, Tommy Morrow found the narrow edge of sleep and crossed it, and the Pacific held him, indifferent and enormous, all the long way to dawn. He woke before the call. Not gradually, not the slow surfacing of an ordinary morning, consciousness arriving in layers like light through cloud. This was immediate. One moment nothing, and then all of him, fully present, in the dock. He lay still for a moment and listened. The ship sounded the same. The engines, the water, the thousand small voices of the hull, going about their business. Nothing had changed in the audible world. And yet something had woken him with the certainty of a hand on the shoulder. And he lay in his bunk at 0430 in the dark and knew, with a knowledge that had no source he could point to, that today was the day. He dressed in the dark. Same order as always. Undershirt, shirt, trousers, socks, wool, boots, left first. His father's watch, he held it for a moment before putting it on, felt the weight of it in his palm, the cracked crystal smooth under his thumb. He put it on his wrist. He put his notebook in his breast pocket. He sat on the edge of his bunk in the dark and breathed for a moment, just breathed, and let the morning be what it was going to be. The call to general quarters came at 0512. Not the soft negotiation of Reveille, this was different. This was the alarm that the ship reserved for the thing it was built for, a sound that had no gentleness in it at all, a sound that said, now, 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 and meant it. The klaxon. 3 blasts. Then the PA, Hollis's voice stripped of its morning civility, clear and fast and absolute. General quarters, general quarters. All hands man your battle stations. This is not a drill. All hands man your battle stations. What happened next was something Tommy had trained for but had not understood the reality of until this moment: the simultaneous movement of 1,900 men through a steel labyrinth toward their designated positions, each man his own river finding its own channel, and the whole thing somehow fluid, somehow functional, somehow not the chaos it should theoretically have been. He was moving before the announcement finished. Into the corridor. Boots on the deck grating, one hand on the overhead pipe for the first corner, then letting go, into the flow of bodies moving aft. Nobody running on a ship was how you fell, how you knocked a man down, how you arrived at your station with a broken arm, but moving fast, moving with the contained urgency of men who know where they are going and why. He passed Marsh going the other direction. Marsh's battle station was forward. Tommy's was amidships, and they passed close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and Marsh looked at him with an expression that Tommy had never seen on Marsh's face before. Not fear. Exactly. Something more like the face of a man who has just understood a joke that he had heard many times without getting. They didn't speak. There was no time and no need. Battle stations for Damage Control Section 3 meant compartments 3A through 3G, all of them, plus the 2 fire suppression substations on the port side amidships, plus responsibility for the watertight integrity of the hull in that section should anything compromise it. Tommy arrived at his primary station 3D, the central point of his section, at 0516. 4 minutes. Beck was already there, because Beck was always already there, standing with his clipboard, marking arrivals, his face doing nothing in particular. Morrow. Chief. Check your board. Tommy went to the damage control board on the forward bulkhead, a schematic of his section, switches and indicators showing the status of every watertight hatch, every valve, every fire suppression line. Green across the board. All hatches dogged. All systems nominal. He logged it. Around him, the section filled. Vasquez, who arrived at 0517 and nodded once at Tommy. Fitch, whose face was the same as always, that quality of internal listening, attending to something. Pritchard, the new one, who arrived last among them at 0519 and whose boots still looked like boots and whose face did not know yet what to do with itself. Beck looked at Pritchard for a moment. "You're here," Beck said. "That's the first thing. Everything else comes after." Pritchard nodded. Some of the uncertainty left his face, replaced by something that was not confidence yet but was pointed in that direction. For 23 minutes, nothing happened. This was the thing that nobody told you, Tommy would think later. In every account of battle he had ever read, things happened immediately. The action began and continued, and the narrative moved forward because narrative required movement. Nobody wrote about the 23 minutes. But the 23 minutes were real, and they were their own particular experience, and in some ways they were the hardest part of the morning. 23 minutes of standing at your station in a closed steel compartment with the men of your section, all of you in your stations, all systems green, all hatches dogged, the ship moving at speed. He could feel the speed, higher than cruising, the engines up, the whole hull vibrating at a different frequency, and nothing yet to do but wait and know and breathe. He thought about Vasquez's advice. It's loud. More than you think. The sound is just sound. Your job is still your job. He went through his section in his mind. Every hatch, every valve, every fire line, every route between positions, rehearsed so many times that he could walk them in the dark, which he might need to do very soon. He stood at his board and looked at his green lights and breathed. Fitch was listening to the engines. Tommy could see at the slight tilt of the head, the attention directed inward and downward, reading the ship through the soles of his feet the way Fitch read everything, through the body rather than the eyes. Vasquez's hands were at his sides. Still. Completely still. Pritchard was looking at the overhead. Beck was writing something in his clipboard, which was either genuine administrative necessity or the most calming performance Tommy had ever witnessed, and he suspected it was both. At 0539 the world changed. It changed with sound first, which was what Vasquez had promised, and Vasquez had not overstated it. Tommy had been near gunfire before. At training, at the range, the sharp hard crack of rifles and the deeper percussion of the larger calibers. He thought he understood loud. He did not understand this. The 16-inch guns of the USS Indiana firing a full broadside is not a sound that fits inside the human category of loud. It is something that reorganizes the body's relationship with the concept. It is concussion as much as noise, a pressure wave that hits the chest like a flat hand, that rattles the teeth, that seems to compress the air in the compartment into something briefly solid. The ship moves with it, a sharp lateral shudder, as though even 35,000 tons feels the departure of those shells. Then the echo of it, rolling through every compartment, every corridor, every space in the ship, arriving as a deep iron resonance that fades slowly, slowly, and before it has finished fading, the guns again. Tommy gripped the edge of his board. Not in fear, or not only in fear, but because the concussion had moved him, physically moved him, a few inches to the left, and he needed something fixed to stand against. He looked at his board. Still green. All green. Your job is still your job. Section check, Beck said, and his voice was absolutely level, absolutely ordinary, and that ordinary levelness was the most useful thing Tommy had ever heard. 3A, nominal. 3B, nominal. 3C. Tommy went through his positions one by one, each man checking in, each space accounting for itself. And for a moment the guns and the noise and the vast exterior violence of what was happening outside the hull existed in a different world from this one, the world of the board and the checklist and the voices of the men of Section 3 saying, "Here, nominal, green, present." Then the ship was hit. Not in their section. Somewhere forward and above they felt it before they heard it. A different kind of impact from the ship's own guns, sharper and less organized. And then a sound that was partly concussion and partly something structural, something yielding. And then the PA. Fire, fire, fire. Class Bravo fire. Compartment 2F damage control. Forward section. Respond. Not Tommy's section. Forward section's call. But Beck was already at the hatch to 3A, opening it, looking forward into the corridor, assessing what was visible. The smell came through before anything else, smoke, but not close, the thin acrid edge of something burning 2 sections away. "Hold your stations," Beck said, without looking back. "Until I tell you otherwise, you hold your stations and you watch your boards." They held. Another broadside from the main guns. The compartment compressed and rang. Tommy watched his board and breathed. In 3C, he knew Vasquez was watching his board and breathing. In 3E, Fitch was listening to the engines, which was still running, which was still whole, which meant the ship was still the ship. In 3G, Pritchard was looking at his indicators, and Tommy did not know what was on Pritchard's face now, but he suspected it was something different from what had been there 20 minutes ago. The battle lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. Tommy would learn this later. In the compartment, time did not work in the ordinary way. It moved in the rhythm of the guns and the damage reports and the check-ins and the moments of silence between actions where the ship seemed to collect itself, and then the next thing, and the next. At 0612 a second hit this one closer, 2 compartments aft of Tommy's section, felt as a very hard shudder and then a sound like a great tearing of metal, and the lights in 3D flickered twice and held, and Tommy looked at his board and one indicator went red. Hatch 3 F2. Compromised. Chief. His voice came out level. He was surprised by this. 3F2 showing breach. Beck was beside him in 4 steps. He looked at the indicator. He looked at Tommy. Take Vasquez and check it. Report back. Move. Tommy moved. The corridor outside 3F was full of smoke. Not thick, not the blinding, choking smoke of a full compartment fire, but present, gray and acrid, drifting from somewhere above and aft, and it changed the quality of the air immediately, made the eyes water, made the instinct pull toward retreat. Tommy did not retreat. He went forward, one hand on the pipe along the overhead, Vasquez behind him, both of them with kerchiefs pulled up over their mouths and noses, which was inadequate but was what there was. Hatch 3F2 was a watertight hatch between his section and the space beyond. When they reached it, Tommy could see immediately the frame had been distorted, bent slightly inward on the port side by the concussion of the knee-by hit, not catastrophically, not a hull breach, but enough that the seal was compromised, enough that in certain conditions it would not hold. He put both hands on it, felt the frame. It'll hold for now, Vasquez said, beside him, doing the same. For now, Tommy agreed. We brace it. We brace it. They braced it. There was a procedure, there was always a procedure. Beck had made sure of that, and they went through it. Securing a damage control shore against the distorted frame, 2 men working in smoke in a narrow corridor while the guns of the Indiana fired overhead and the ship shook with its own violence and the violence done to it. It took 7 minutes. When they were done, Vasquez put his hand on the frame and pushed. The hatch held. Good, he said. Tommy nodded. His hands were shaking, slightly, which he observed without judgment. They had done the work. The hands could have their opinion about it afterward. He keyed his intercom. Chief, 3F2 braced and holding. Frame distortion, no breach. Recommend full assessment when we're clear. Copy, Beck said. Return to station. They returned. The 4 hours and 11 minutes accumulated. More hits, none in Tommy's section, though 2 more close enough to feel the structural events, the ship expressing its damage in groans and shudders that came up through the soles of the feet. More reports on the PA. More calls for forward section, then aft section, then a long sequence of announcements that built a picture of the ship's condition that Tommy assembled in his mind as he worked. Not the full picture, never the full picture from this far below the waterline, but enough to understand that the Indiana was fighting and absorbing and fighting still, which meant she was winning, or at least not losing, which at this moment were the same thing. At one point Beck appeared at Tommy's shoulder and stood for a moment watching him work through a systems check, and said nothing, and then said, "You're doing well, Morrow. Not the section is doing well. You." Tommy did not know what to do with this in the moment, so he filed it and kept working. At 0847 the guns fell silent. Not gradually, all at once, the way a storm ends there, and then not there. And the silence that followed was the most extraordinary thing Tommy had experienced all morning, richer and more complex than ordinary silence because of everything it was made from, all the sound that had preceded it, all the sound it was now the absence of. The ship moved through it, still moving, still whole, still the Indiana. Tommy stood at his board. All lights green except the flag 3F2, which was braced and holding. He looked at every indicator on the board slowly, one by one, the way you look at something you want to be sure about. Then he sat down on the deck, his back against the bulkhead, his legs out in front of him, and he breathed. Vasquez sat down beside him. For a long while neither of them said anything. Then Vasquez said, "You did all right." "We all right," Tommy said. "Yes," Vasquez said. "We are." Tommy reached into his breast pocket, took out his notebook. His hands were steady and now not fully steady, but moving in the right direction. He opened to a fresh page. He wrote, "Day 50. He sat for a moment, looking at those two words. Then he wrote, "We held." He closed the notebook. Outside the hull, the Pacific turned and breathed, enormous and indifferent as it had always been, and the ship that had held sat in the middle of it like a fact-battered present. Still the Indiana and the morning that had changed everything moved slowly, slowly into afternoon, and the men of Section 3 sat on the deck of Compartment 3D and breathed the air that was still theirs to breathe. And the silence where the guns had been was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever heard. The silence after battle is not peaceful. It resembles peace from the outside. The guns have stopped. The alarms have ceased. The PA has gone quiet. The ship moves through the water with the same motion it has always had, that slow and deep negotiation between steel and sea. And if you did not know what had just happened, you might stand on the deck and look at the ocean and think, calm. You might think, still. But the men who have been inside it know that the silence is not the absence of the battle. It is the battle, continuing by other means. It lives in the body now, in the hands that are not quite steady, in the eyes that keep moving to the hatchways, in the particular exhaustion that is not tiredness but something deeper, something at the cellular level, the body having spent reserves it didn't know it had and now presenting the bill. Tommy sat on the deck of Compartment 3D for 6 minutes. He counted them on his father's watch. Then he stood up, because there was work to do, and the work was what he had. The assessment of damage begins the moment the guns fall silent, and it is its own kind of battle, quieter, slower, conducted with clipboards and torches and careful hands rather than steel and fire, but requiring its own form of courage, which is the courage to look clearly at what has happened and record it truthfully, without minimizing and without catastrophizing. Because the ship's survival going forward depends on knowing exactly what it is now, as opposed to what it was before. Beck assembled the section at 0900. He looked different, Tommy thought. Not shaken. Beck did not shake but used. The way a tool looks after heavy work, still sound, still itself, but with the evidence of effort in it. There was a graze along his left forearm, visible below the rolled sleeve, that hadn't been there this morning. And when Tommy looked at it, Beck caught him looking and said, "Caught a fitting on the way back from forward. It's nothing." And moved on. "Full section assessment," he said. "Every compartment, every system, every piece of equipment. I want eyes on everything in the next 2 hours. You report what you find. You don't interpret it. You don't decide whether it matters. You report it, and let the engineers decide what it means. Questions? No questions. Vasquez, take Morrow. Start at 3A and work aft. I'll take forward and meet you in the middle." They moved. The work of assessment is slow and specific, and in its slowness it is, Tommy found, a mercy. It gives the hand something to do, which gives the mind something to follow, which keeps the mind from going where it would otherwise go, back into the 4 hours and 11 minutes, replaying and second-guessing and asking the questions that have no useful answers. The body, when occupied, is a kinder place to be than the body at rest, in the hours immediately following something like this. He and Vasquez moved through the compartments methodically, torches on, eyes on every surface, checking the overhead for any sign of structural deformation, running hands along the bulkheads, feeling for distortion, testing each hatch in sequence, the familiar ritual of push and pull and the satisfying resistance of a seal that holds. In 3B they found a cracked weld along the pot bulkhead hairline, non-critical, but real. Vasquez photographed it and logged it and marked it with a piece of chalk, the standard procedure, and they moved on. In 3D their primary station, the compartment where they had spent the morning, one of the overhead pipe brackets had sheared partway through, again from concussion, again non-critical for now, but something that needed attention before the next time there was a next time. In 3F they returned to the hatch they had braced in the middle of the battle, and Vasquez ran his hands along the frame again slowly, feeling what the frame had to say for itself. "Good work," he said, which Tommy understood was not compliment but assessment. "It'll need a proper repair," Tommy said. "Yes, but it held." It held. They logged it and moved on. It was in 3G that Tommy found Pritchard. The young seaman was sitting on a damage control locker with his back against the bulkhead and his knees drawn up and his arms around his knees, and he was not doing anything. Not visibly distressed, not shaking, not making any sound, just sitting in the particular stillness of a person who has been somewhere they were not prepared for and has not yet found their way back. Tommy stopped. Vasquez, who was already moving toward the aft bulkhead to check the welds, glanced back and saw what Tommy saw and kept moving, which was a right thing, which Tommy noted. He sat down on the deck beside Pritchard. Not close enough to crowd, just close enough to be present. For a moment he said nothing. The ship moved around them. Somewhere 2 compartments forward someone was talking in the ordinary voice of work. "First time," Tommy said. Pritchard looked at him. His eyes had the quality Tommy had noticed in some men after hard things, slightly too wide, seeing more than what was in front of them. "Yes," Pritchard said. Tommy nodded. He thought about what Vasquez had said to him 3 days ago, sitting against the bulkhead with the beads turning in his hands. The deliberateness of it. What to say, and what to leave. "It'll be different next time," Tommy said. "Not easier, exactly, but different. You'll know more of it." Pritchard was quiet. "My hands," he said after a moment, and held them out, and they were shaking. He looked at them with a kind of puzzled attention, as though they belonged to someone else. "That's just the body," Tommy said. "That's not you. Give it an hour." Pritchard looked at him. "How do you know?" Tommy thought about this honestly. "I don't," he said. "But Vasquez told me, and Vasquez knows." Something shifted in Pritchard's face. Not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of the direction toward it. The knowledge that he was not the only man who had sat in a compartment after his first battle with shaking hands and 2 wide eyes. That there were men who had been here before and had continued, and that their continuation was a kind of evidence. "We've got the aft bulkheads to check," Tommy said, standing. "When you're ready." He did not say come on or get up or any of the things that would have made it in order. He left it where it was and turned and went to help Vasquez with the welds. 2 minutes later Pritchard stood up and joined them, and his hands were still shaking slightly, and he did his work. By noon the section assessment was complete. Beck reviewed the logs at the mess table that had been repurposed as a command station, going through each entry with the focused attention of a man reading a language he knows very well, asking occasional questions, noting things in his own log, cross-referencing with reports coming in from engineering. The damage to the Indiana was real, but not catastrophic. She had taken 3 hits, Tommy learned this now, from the reports moving through the section. 1 forward, which had caused the Class Bravo fire in compartment 2F, now extinguished. 1 amidships on the starboard side, which had killed 2 men and wounded 4, and which Tommy tried to sit with for a moment, tried to let be real, the way you had to let things be real even when the mind moved instinctively to protect itself by making them abstract. 2 men. Names he didn't know. On this ship? In this day? In this water? Real. The third hit had been aft, causing structural damage to the rear superstructure that was serious but not, the engineers believed, fatal to the ship's fighting capability. She was still the Indiana. She was still moving. The mess hall opened for lunch at 1200 and Tommy went, because Beck's instruction about eating applied now more than ever, and because the act of sitting at a table with food was the most comprehensively ordinary thing he could think of, and he needed ordinary with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. The hall was different than it had been yesterday and every day before. Quiet and not silent, but with a quality of quiet underneath the conversation, a frequency of experience shared that meant the men did not need to speak much to be in communication with one another. They had been through the same morning. They knew without saying. Marsh was there, already eating, and Tommy sat across from him and looked at Marsh's face, and saw what was there. Marsh looked older. Not dramatically, not the sudden aging of film and fiction, the hair gone white overnight. Just a small and real change in the eyes, a knowledge in them that had not been there yesterday, the knowledge that changes a face permanently and subtly once it arrives. The knowledge of what it means when people say it. He was still eating with considerable commitment. Some things were bedrock. The potatoes, Tommy said. Marsh looked up. Something moved across his face, relief, Tommy thought, at the normalcy of it, at someone meeting him where he usually was. Good today, Marsh said. Better than yesterday. Everything, Marsh said, seriously, is better than yesterday. He meant it as a joke and he meant it entirely literally, and both were true, and they left it there between them on the table and ate. In the afternoon Tommy was given 2 hours of stand-down. This was unusual and deliberate. The ship's medical officer had recommended rest periods for all non-essential personnel in the hours following the engagement, understanding that the body after sustained high-alert burns through something that cannot be immediately replaced and requires, at minimum, horizontal time and quiet. Tommy went to his bunk. He did not expect to sleep and did not sleep. He lay on his back with his hands folded on his chest and looked at the underside of the bunk above him, the geography of it so familiar now it was like a room he had lived in for years. He thought about the hatch in 3F. The 7 minutes in the smoke, Vasquez's hands beside his on the frame, the procedure working the way procedures are supposed to work, the hatch holding. He thought about the 2 men he did not know and would look up later their names, where they were from, whether anyone here had known them the way Marsh knew Marsh, the way Vasquez knew Vasquez, completely and from the inside. He thought about his father's watch on his wrist and the cracked crystal that kept perfect time. He thought about Pritchard sitting with his knees drawn up, his shaking hands held out, that puzzled expression these belonged to someone else, and then Pritchard standing, and the standing mattering as much as anything Tommy had seen today. He thought about Beck's voice saying you're doing well, Morrow, its quality of simple fact. The courtesy of it. Being seen clearly by someone who saw clearly. He reached into his breast pocket and took out his notebook. He wrote for a long time. He wrote about the sound of the guns, trying to get it accurate, knowing language was insufficient, but trying anyway because the trying was the point. He wrote about the smoke in the corridor, the gray of it, the smell. He wrote about the board with its green lights and the one that went red and what it felt like to say Chief, 3F2 showing breach in a voice that came out level, which he still found remarkable. He wrote about Pritchard's hands. He wrote about the silence when the guns stopped, trying again to find words for something that exceeded them, settling finally for. The silence was everything we had survived, made audible. He read that back. He left it. He wrote, at the bottom of the page, 2 men died today whose names I don't know. I am going to find out their names. That seems important. That seems like the least of what is owed. He closed the notebook. He lay in the hum and the motion of the ship. Outside, The Pacific moved in long gray swells toward a horizon that looked the same as it always had, vast, indifferent, beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are too large to be anything else. The Indiana moved through it, carrying her damage and her dead and her 1,897 living souls, and the afternoon light moved on the water, and the engines hummed their low and constant note, and Tommy Morrow lay in his bunk in the deep middle of the ship and felt, beneath the exhaustion and the residue of fear and the weight of the day, something else. Something quiet and resistant and difficult to name precisely. Not pride, exactly. Not relief, though relief was part of it. Something older than either. The knowledge of having been tested and found not invincible, not unafraid but present. Functional. Capable of the thing that was required, when the thing that was required came. He had held. The section had held. The ship had held. That was what today was. He closed his eyes. The ship breathed around him. Slowly, without meaning to, without fighting it or chasing it, he slept. The days after a battle have their own texture. Not the charged, compressed texture of the waiting days before that particular density of unspent intention, all those men carrying something that had not yet been asked of them. This is different. Looser in some ways, heavier in others. The ship after battle moves through a world that has been altered by what happened in it, and the men move through the ship in the same way still themselves, still doing the work, still eating and sleeping and standing watch, but with an additional weight to every ordinary thing, as though each action now carries the memory of what was risked to be able to perform it. Making coffee, checking a hatch, writing in a notebook. All of it slightly heavier, all of it slightly more. The repairs began the morning after. This was the Navy's way. Grief and damage both attended to practically and without excessive ceremony, because the ship needed to be functional more urgently than the men needed to be allowed to feel. Tommy did not resent this, or only resented it briefly, and then understood it. A ship that cannot function cannot keep its men alive. And keeping the men alive was always the first argument. He spent 2 days in the work of it. The cracked weld in 3B was ground out and re-welded by a machinist named Okonkwo, who did it with the focused grace of someone for whom metal was a medium as natural as language, laying the bead with a steadiness that Tommy watched for a while, because the watching was instructive. You could learn from a man who was entirely at home in his work. The quality of the attention itself was the lesson. The pipe bracket in 3D was replaced. The hatch frame in 3F. The hatch. Tommy had started thinking of it. Vasquez and his. The 7 minutes in the smoke was assessed by an engineer who ran his hands over it with the same slow attention Vasquez had used, and declared it repairable but in need of more than a show and some effort. It was properly reframed over the course of an afternoon. And when it was done, Tommy tested it himself, both hands on the frame, pushing, and it held with a solidity that the old frame had not had, better than before the battle, stronger for having been broken and remade. He thought about this for a while afterward, didn't write it down. Some things you carried rather than recorded. The 2 men's names were Seaman First Class Harold Greer, from Macon, Georgia, and Petty Officer 3rd Class William Soto, from Sacramento, California. Tommy found this out from the casualty list that was quietly circulated through the section the day after the battle, typed on a single sheet and passed hand to hand without ceremony, which was its own kind of ceremony. He wrote the names in his notebook, just the names, on a page by themselves. Harold Greer, Macon, Georgia. William Soto, Sacramento, California. He sat with them for a while. He had not known either man. The Indiana was too large for casual acquaintance across sections, and their paths had not crossed in his 6 weeks aboard in any way he could remember. This bothered him, and then he let it stop bothering him, because the not knowing was simply a fact of this life, the consequence of 1,900 men in 680 feet, and the not knowing did not change what was owed. What was owed was to know the names. He had the names. He would keep them. The memorial was held on the third day after the battle. On the fantail, the open deck at the stern at 0800, in thin cool light, the crew gathering in whatever numbers could be spared from watch and maintenance, which was most of them. Tommy stood between Vasquez and Marsh. Behind them, Fitch. Beside Fitch, Pritchard, whose boots had acquired their first real scuff and whose face had completed some internal rearrangement that had been ongoing since the morning of the battle. The chaplain spoke first. He was a man of middle age with the particular quality of men who have done this before, who have stood at the stern of ships in Pacific light and said words over water, and he spoke without excess, without reaching for emotion that wasn't already present, simply naming what had happened and placing it in a frame that was neither too large nor too small for the men who were listening. He spoke Harold Greer's name. He spoke William Soto's name. The names spoken aloud in that light, above that water, were different from the names on the page. More solid, more insistent. They asked something of the men who heard them that the typed list had not quite asked, and Tommy felt the asking and stood straight in it. The captain spoke briefly, which Tommy respected. Long speeches at memorials had always seemed to him to save the speaker more than the dead, and the captain was not that kind of man. A few sentences, plain and genuine, about the two men's service, about what they had done and who they had been, and then silence. A boatswain's whistle. The ocean. It was on the evening of the memorial that the mail arrived. Mail on a ship at sea was an event of considerable emotional weight, out of all proportion to the physical reality of it. A canvas bag, carried aboard by supply transfer, handled by the mail petty officer, sorted into the small covers in the mail compartment. It happened infrequently, dependent on resupply schedules and the ship's movements, and between arrivals it was possible to go many weeks without word from anyone outside the hull, which was its own kind of isolation, not cruel, exactly, just complete. Tommy had been 6 weeks without a letter. His name was called in the mail compartment at 1830, and he took the envelope and looked at his mother's handwriting on the front, her careful cursive, the particular loop of the capital T in Thomas, unchanged from every letter she had written him since he left Decatur, and felt something move in his chest that he hadn't expected. Not sentiment, exactly. Something more structural. Something load-bearing. He took the letter to his bunk. He lay on his side, facing the bulkhead, the letter open in front of him. She had written 3 pages in her close, even hand, and he read them slowly, the way you eat something good without hurrying, attending to each part. She was well. His father's back had been troubling him, but was better now, the warm weather helping. His younger sister Cora had started working at the munitions plant in Decatur, which she found tiring but not unpleasant, and she was putting money aside with a seriousness that their mother found both admirable and faintly comic, Cora having not previously been known for financial restraint. The neighbor's son, Robert, had been sent to Europe. Mrs. Hathaway at the end of the street had organized a salvage drive that had collected an impressive quantity of metal and a somewhat less impressive quantity of rubber, and had declared the whole enterprise a great success regardless. The garden was coming in. The tomatoes looked promising. His father had fixed the corner of the linoleum. Tommy stopped. "Read that again." "Your father finally got around to that corner of the linoleum by the back door, you know, the one. It's only been lifting for 3 years. He did it on a Sunday morning and was very pleased with himself, and I took a photograph which I will enclose, but then I couldn't find the photograph, so I will send it next time. I thought you would want to know." Tommy lay very still for a moment. He thought about writing the letter, 2 weeks ago now, in the days before the battle, sitting at the mess table and thinking, I hope someone has fixed it. And then not thinking about it anymore because the thinking about it part was done. And someone had. His father, on a Sunday morning, pleased with himself. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it in the breast pocket of his peacoat, which he kept on the hook by his bunk, next to the notebook. It would live there now. He understood this without deciding it. The last page of the letter had been different from the rest. His mother was not a woman who said difficult things directly. She communicated in the way of certain Midwestern women of her generation, through implication and the careful placement of ordinary detail. And you had to read her the way you read certain kinds of weather, attending to what was beneath the surface of the thing said. The last page had been mostly ordinary. A recipe she had found that she thought he might like, once he was home. A mention of the radio program they had both enjoyed on Thursday evenings, how she still listened to it. And then, at the very bottom, in handwriting that was slightly smaller than the rest, as though she had not decided to write it until the pen was already moving. I don't know where you are or what you are doing, and I understand that you can't tell me, and I am at peace with that. Truly I am. I only want you to know that I think about you every morning when I open the kitchen and every evening when I close it up, and that your father and I are proud beyond what I know how to say in a letter. You be careful. You come home. That's the only instruction. Tommy read this several times. Then he put the letter away and lay on his back and looked at the overhead. The ship was quiet around him, the evening quiet. Men at rest, the watch rotation humming below the surface of things. Somewhere a few compartments away someone was playing a harmonica, softly, something slow and minor that might have been a hymn or might have been a song Tommy didn't know. He thought about his mother at the kitchen window in the evening, closing up. He thought about his father on a Sunday morning, pleased with himself, the linoleum finally fixed. He thought, I am going to go home. Not as a wish, as a decision, as something he was choosing with the same deliberateness with which he chose to do his job well, to check every hatch, to hold the brace in the smoke until the hatch held. It was the same thing, he thought. The decision to go home and the decision to do his work were the same decision, arrived at from different directions. He reached for his notebook. He wrote, Day 53. Memorial this morning. Greer and Soto. The names spoken out loud are different from the names on a page. Letter from Mom tonight. Dad fixed the linoleum. She says come home. I intend to. He paused. He wrote, the harmonica in the compartment to port is playing something I can't identify. It's good. Whoever it is, they are good. He put the notebook away. He lay in the harmonica and the ship and the evening, and outside the hull the Pacific moved in its enormous indifferent way, and the stars were out. He knew this without seeing it, knew it by the quality of the night. By 6 weeks of learning the ship's moods and the skies, and the ship moved beneath them southward and the stars moved above, and between the ship and the stars the sea was dark and wide and full of everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. He was tired in a way that went all the way through him. He closed his eyes. The harmonica played. The ship breathed. He thought, briefly and without sadness, about Harold Greer and William Soto. And he said their names once quietly in the deck, because the saying seemed to be the minimum of what was owed, and because no one would hear it but the ship, and the ship, he had come to believe, kept everything you gave it. Then he slept. There is a kind of time that only exists at sea. Not clock time. The Indiana ran on clock time with absolute precision, the watch rotations changing on the hour, every hour. The ship's day divided into its parts with the regularity of a mechanism, which it was. Not subjective time, either, the elastic kind that contracts under boredom and stretches under fear. This was something else. A third kind. The kind that accumulates in long passages across open water when the days begin to resemble each other so closely that the mind stops marking them individually and starts experiencing them as a single sustained thing, the way you experience a long note held on an instrument not as a series of moments, but as one continuous presence. The Indiana had been at sea for 11 days since the battle. Tommy had stopped counting the way he had counted before. The notebook still recorded the days he had not missed an entry, but the counting had changed character. It was no longer a man marking time towards something unknown. It was a man recording a life being lived, which was different, which felt different in the hands. He had settled into the ship the way water settles into a landscape. This was the only way he could think to describe it later, not that he had adapted, not that he had become accustomed, but that he had found the shape of the place and occupied it. And the occupying had changed both him and the place slightly, the way water changes the stone it moves through, and is changed by the moving. He knew the ship differently now. He knew it the way you know a person you have lived alongside through difficulty, not just their surface, not just their habits and routines, but the deeper thing, the quality of their endurance. What they are made of when making of the ordinary kind is not enough. He knew the Indiana's sounds at different speeds, the way the engine note changed when she pushed past 27 knots, the particular groan of the hull in a beam sea, the different quality of silence in the lower compartments at 0300 versus 1500. He knew her the way Fitch knew her, through the soles of his feet, through the palms of his hands, through 6 weeks in a battle and 11 days of long water, moving south by southwest toward the next thing. He had not yet been told what the next thing was. Neither had anyone else, as far as he could determine. The scuttlebutt ran its usual channels, the yeoman's word, the radioman's expression, the officer pausing too long in a corridor, but nothing definitive had emerged. And Beck, when Tommy had asked with what he hoped was a right degree of casualness, had said, "When I know something I can tell you, I'll tell you," which was not reassuring but was at least honest, and honesty from Beck was always worth more than reassurance from someone else. The days organized themselves around the watch rotation. Tommy stood the 4 to 8 watch, 0400 to 0800 in the morning, 1600 to 2000 in the evening. The morning watch was his favorite, and he had not expected this. He had not been a morning person before the Navy, or had not thought of himself as one. But the 4 o'clock watch had something to it that the other rotations didn't, a quality of firstness, of being among the first to receive the day, to see the light come, to watch the ocean make the transition from whatever it was in the dark to whatever it became in the light, which was different every morning and always the same. He stood his portion of the watch at Damage Control Station 3, running checks in the rhythm he could now do without thought, which left the thinking part of his mind free to go where it wanted, which was increasingly somewhere quiet and interior and hard to name. He had been writing more. Not just the daily entries, those continued, brief and factual, the record of temperatures and headings and meals and small events, but other things, longer things. Attempts to put into language the experience of the last 2 months that went beyond the factual, that reached for the quality of things rather than the mere fact of them. He was not sure he was succeeding. He was not sure success was the point. "You write a lot," Marsh had observed one evening, watching Tommy at the mess table with his notebook. "Yes," Tommy said. "What do you write?" Tommy considered. "What it's like," he said. Marsh thought about this seriously, the way Marsh thought about most things. "Can you get it?" he asked. "In writing. Can you actually get what it's like?" "No," Tommy said. "But you get closer than if you don't try." Marsh nodded slowly. This seemed to satisfy him. He returned to his cards. On the 7th day of the long passage, Vasquez taught Tommy to play chess. This happened in the way most things happened between them, without preamble, without formal arrangement, as though it had always been going to happen and they were simply arriving at the moment that had been waiting. Vasquez produced a set from somewhere, small pieces, a board that folded for storage, worn smooth from long handling, and set it up on the mess table between their coffee cups and looked at Tommy with his usual expression of calm assessment. "You know the pieces?" "Roughly," Tommy said, which meant no. Vasquez showed him each piece in turn. Not rushing, not condescending. The way Beck showed men equipment, naming the thing, explaining its range and its limitation, moving on. "The Queen moves anywhere," Vasquez said. "The Queen," Tommy said. "The King moves everywhere the Queen moves, one square at a time." "Why only one?" Vasquez looked at him. "Because the King," he said, "is the most important piece. The one you cannot lose. And the most important thing must be protected." He said this as simple chess instruction, and Tommy received it as simple chess instruction, and they began to play, and it was only later, lying in his bunk, that Tommy turned the sentence over and found what else might be living inside it. He lost every game for 4 days. On the 5th day he almost didn't lose, which Vasquez noted with a small movement of the mouth that was as close as Vasquez came to enthusiasm. On the 6th day he lost again, badly, and felt better about it than the almost win, because the losing was at least honest and the almost win had made him reach for something he hadn't earned yet. "You're getting it," Vasquez said. "I'm losing." "You're losing better." A pause. "That's how it goes." The night watch. There was a rotation that gave each man in the section, once every 10 days or so, a 2-hour watch that was partly above decks, one man at the stern, maintaining a visual watch in conjunction with the instruments, the redundancy that seamanship insisted on. It was not, in practical terms, a critical post. The Indiana had radar, had instruments, had eyes far more sophisticated than one man standing at the stern in the dark. But the Navy believed in the human eye as a principle, and so the watch existed, and on day 58 it was Tommy's. He went above at 0200. The night was clear, not the obscured murk of the storm nights or the sicklet cloud of the days before the battle, clear and cold and full of stars, more stars than any night he had seen since childhood. Since lying in the yard in Decatur on August nights when the Milky Way was visible, a thing he had loved and then forgotten he loved and was now remembering. He stood at the stern with his hands on the rail and his face turned up. The wake spread out behind the ship in its 2 white lines of phosphorescence, and beyond the wake the ocean extended to the horizon in every direction, and the horizon was not the edge of anything but the edge of what could be seen, and beyond it the ocean continued, and beyond the ocean the continents and the cities and the kitchens and the linoleum corners and the radio programs on Thursday evenings, all of it out there, all of it continuing, all of it entirely itself regardless of weather. Tommy Morrow stood at the stern of a battleship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, looking at it from 11 days away. He breathed. The cold came off the water and moved through his peacoat, and he let it, because cold at sea after enough time stopped being uncomfortable and became instead informative, a communication from the water about the latitude, the season, the particular character of the night. He thought about the battle. He had not let himself think about it directly in the days since. He had thought around it, had approached it obliquely through the notebook entries, had let it exist as context rather than subject. But tonight, alone at the stern under the enormous stars, he let himself think about it plainly. He had been afraid. Not the clean, useful fear that Beck had described, or not only that. In the 7 minutes in the smoke, bracing the hatch, there had been a moment where the fear had moved towards something less functional, something that had wanted to be larger than the task, and he had held it back the way you hold back a door in a wind, not by denying the wind existed, but by simply staying in the doorway. He had held it. He thought about this honestly, tried to understand what holding it had consisted of, not some act of will exactly, not the clenching of courage like a fist. More like choosing, again and again, in each second of the 7 minutes, to take the next action that the training indicated, to keep moving, to stay in the procedure, which was another way of saying to stay in the present moment, to not go forward into imagined disaster or backward into the desire for somewhere safer, but to be in the smoke, with the hatch, with Vasquez, doing the next thing. It was not heroism. He was clear about this. He had thought about heroism before the Navy the way young men think about it, as something large and conscious, arising to the moment with full awareness of the rising, the way it looked in the films at the Rialto on Saturday afternoons. What he had experienced in Compartment 3F was nothing like that. It was smaller and more interior. It was just doing the work while being afraid of the work, which he suspected was what most of the actual texture of bravery consisted of, if bravery was even the right word, which he wasn't sure it was. He thought he might try to write about this. He thought it might take a long time to find the right words. He was all right with that. He thought about Harold Greer and William Soto. He did this deliberately, not allowing the thought to stay peripheral, bringing it to the center and holding it there. 2 men. On this ship. In this water. Gone. He did not have a framework for this that satisfied him. He had the chaplain's words, which had been good words, true words, but which operated in a register that was not entirely his. He had the instinct, stronger since the battle, to treat the living with more attention, to see Pritchard standing up after sitting down, to hear the harmonica in the deck, to notice the weight of Marsh's newly knowing eyes, as though the fact of Greer and Soto required the living to be more fully inhabited, more fully attended to, as a kind of answer. He did not know if this was the right framework. He thought it was the one he had. He stood at the rail and looked at the wake and thought, I have their names. I will always have their names. It wasn't enough. It was what there was. An hour into the watch the ship changed course. He felt it before he saw it, the subtle shift in the angle of the wake, the stars moving slightly in their positions above the stern, the change in the wind's direction relative to his face. He watched the compass on the rail mount and confirmed it. They had come east, maybe 15 degrees. Adjusting. He noted it in the watch log. He stood in the new heading and felt the ocean moving differently under the ship, the swell coming from a slightly different angle, the ship's motion adjusting its rhythm. East. He thought about what was east of them. He thought about what Beck had said, before the battle, the kind that gets written about. He wondered if there was another such place ahead, waiting for them on the other side of the horizon. He thought there probably was. He thought he was probably readier for it than he had been. Not unafraid. He understood now that unafraid was not the destination, but readier, more inhabited, more himself, in the way that the man who stood at this rail was more himself than the boy who had stood on the platform in Decatur and gripped his father's hand. He thought, you know what you are. He thought he was beginning to. At 0400 the watch changed and Tommy came below. He went through the familiar sequence: hatch, ladder, corridor, the warmth returning, the yellow light. He stopped at the head and washed his face in cold water and looked at himself in the small mirror above the sink. He looked at the face for a while. It was the same face as before. Mostly. The same eyes, the same jaw, the same unobjectionable features that his mother had always called a good honest face, Tommy, which is better than a handsome one. But there was something in it that had not been there in Decatur, and he studied it without being able to name it, the way you study a word in another language that you understand but cannot translate. He dried his face on the rough towel. He went to his bunk. He took out his notebook and wrote, quietly, without the lamp so as not to wake the sleeping men around him, by the small light of the passageway through the curtain. Day 58. Night watch, 0200 to 0400. Clear sky. More stars than I have words for. Changed heading east at 0310 15 degrees, approximate. Don't know what's east. He paused. He wrote, thought about the battle tonight, plainly, for the first time. I think I understand what I did and what I did not do. I did not rise to anything. I did not become anyone other than who I was. I just stayed in the next moment, And then the next. I think that might be all it is. I think that might be enough. He paused again. Gria and Soto said their names to the ocean. The ocean kept going. I think that's what oceans do with what you give them, not take it away, but carry it forward, wherever they're going. Dad fixed the linoleum. Mom says come home. I intend to. He closed the notebook. Around him the ship breathed in its deep mechanical way, the engines and the water and the small nighttime sounds of 1,897 people existing in close proximity to each other, dreaming their separate dreams, carrying their separate weights, moving east together through the dark. Tommy Morrow lay in his bunk and felt the ship under him and the night above and the long water on all sides, and he thought, I am here. I am entirely here. And that was the last thing he thought before sleep came for him gently, like the tide coming in, unhurried and complete. You can feel a ship preparing itself. Not through any single thing, not one announcement or order or change in the routine that announces the fact plainly. It is more distributed than that, more woven through the texture of the days. The way you can feel a season changing not because any single morning is dramatically different from the one before it, but because the accumulation of small differences, the angle of the light, the temperature of the air at 0600, the behavior of birds, if there are any birds, eventually adds up to something unmistakable. The Indiana was preparing. Tommy felt it on the morning of the 4th day east, when the maintenance schedules were quietly intensified. Felt it in the afternoon when the gunnery crews ran drills that were more frequent and more serious than the routine exercises of the passage weeks. Felt it in the evening when the officers' demeanor shifted slightly, not dramatically. Nothing you could point to and say there. That is the signal, but a quality of attention that was higher than it had been, a focus that had been turned up a register, the way you turn up a lamp when the light outside begins to fade. He felt it in his own hands. They had begun, without his instructing them to, the habitual checking of the things they were responsible for. Running the sequence of his section systems the way a pianist runs scales, not because he had been told to, not because there was anything wrong, but because the hands needed the reassurance of the familiar sequence, and the familiar sequence was its own form of preparation. He let them. He understood now that the body often knew what the mind was still working out. On the 5th day, Beck called the section together. It was 1900. The evening watch just changed, the mess hall clearing after dinner. The section gathered in compartment 3D, their compartment. Tommy thought of it now. The 16 of them and their chief, this particular configuration of men who had been through the battle together and the long water after, and who were now, without formal declaration, something that had not existed 7 weeks ago when they first assembled. Beck stood with his clipboard and looked at them in his way. The lamplight in 3D was the same yellow it had always been. The repaired hatch frame in 3F was 2 compartments aft. The patch on the 3B weld was invisible now, smooth underpaint. The repair better than what had been there before. We're 3 days out, Beck said. No further identification. No name, no coordinates, no strategic context. 3 days out was all he gave them, and all he needed to, because the men of Section 3 were, by now, capable of reading what 3 days out meant when said in Beck's voice, at this time, in this configuration. The engagement will be larger than the last one, he said. The compartment held this without visible reaction, which Tommy thought was its own kind of readiness, not the absence of feeling, but the presence of something that had learned to contain feeling without being diminished by it. What you did last time, you do again. Better if you can. The same if you can't. Your section was good. I want it to be better. Not because it wasn't enough, it was enough. Because better is always the direction. He looked around the compartment. The slow, deliberate assessment. I know some of you are writing letters, he said. Write them. Send them. Don't use the writing of them to say goodbye. Use it to say what you actually want to say, which is that you are here and you are thinking of your people and you will continue to be here and thinking of them. That's the better letter. That's the one that does the right work on both ends. He said this without sentiment, and it was the more affecting for the absence of it. Questions. A pause. Then Pritchard, whose boots were scuffed now, and whose face had completed its rearrangement, said, "Chief, is there anything we should do different, based on last time?" Beck looked at him. "Yes," he said. "Trust yourselves sooner. You waited longer than you needed to last time to believe that you could do the thing. That's understandable the first time. The second time, start from the belief and work forward. It's faster." Pritchard nodded. Beck looked around once more. "That's all. Good evening." And he left, and the section stood in the compartment he had vacated, and Marsh said, quietly and to no one in particular, "He's something, isn't he?" And nobody disagreed. Tommy wrote the letter that night. Beck's instruction had clarified something he had been circling for days without landing on the question of what to say, which was really the question of how to be present in a letter when presence was the thing the distance made impossible. He had been approaching it as a problem of information, of finding the permissible facts that could substitute for the true ones. He had been wrong about this. He sat at the mess table in the late evening, the compartment quiet, most men already in their bunks, and he wrote, "Dear Mom, I got your letter. Dad fixed the linoleum, which is the best news I have had in a long time, and I mean that without irony, which you will understand when I tell you that out here the small ordinary things become very large. Not because the large things aren't large, they are enormous. I will tell you about them someday when I'm sitting in the kitchen, and there's coffee, and it doesn't matter so much that it takes a long time, but because the ordinary things turn out to be what everything else is made of. The linoleum, the kitchen in the morning, Thursday radio. These are not small. I was wrong to think they were small." He paused. Read it back. Kept going. "I am well. I want to be more specific than that because I know I am well is what men say regardless of whether they are well, and you are too smart for it. So, I am tired in a way that is not bad, the way you are tired after a day of real work. I have learned things I did not know about myself that I am glad to know. I have met men who are extraordinary in the way of men who do not know they are extraordinary, which I find is the best kind. I am careful. I think about you every morning when the watch changes and every evening when it changes back, which is my version of the kitchen." He stopped. Thought about what Beck had said. "Say what you actually want to say." "What I want to say is this. I think about home the way I think about the thing I am steering toward, which is the truest thing I know how to put in a letter. I am not saying goodbye. I am saying I will see you in the kitchen, and Dad's back, and Cora savings, and the garden in June, and the radio on Thursday, and the corner of the linoleum that no longer lifts. I am saying all of that as a promise, which I intend to keep. Your Tommy." He folded it, addressed it, put it with the outgoing. He sat at the table for a moment after. He felt the letter leave him differently than the others had. The others he had sent had felt like communications. This one felt like something more deliberate, a staking of a claim, a declaration in the direction of the future. He had written it the way you drive a stake into ground, marking a place you intend to return to. He intended to return to it. The days that followed were the days of becoming ready. The maintenance intensified. The drills became daily, then twice daily. The section moving through its procedures with an increasing fluency that Tommy could measure not in any single performance, but in the accumulation of them, the way the response time shortened, the way communication between the men became more abbreviated and more precise, the way each man's knowledge of every other man's section deepened. Because in action the boundaries between responsibilities blurred, and what you needed was not just mastery of your own ground but familiarity with all of it. He and Vasquez spent an evening going through each other's primary stations, Tommy walking Vasquez through every system in 3D and 3, as though Vasquez had never seen them, Vasquez doing the same for 3F and 3G. Not because either of them didn't know, because knowing it from the other side was different, and different was better. If something happens to me, Tommy said, during this, and then stopped. Vasquez looked at him without alarm. 3D board, Tommy said. The third valve from the left runs slow. Give it an extra turn. The indicator will say it's open before it fully is. Vasquez nodded. Filed it. 3F hatch, he said. The brace we put in runs a 1/4 inch long on the port side. Account for it when you check the seal. Noted, Tommy said. They went on. This was the real preparation, Tommy thought. Not the drills, which were important. Not the equipment checks, which were essential. This, the exchange of specific knowledge between men who trusted each other, was the thing underneath everything else. The thing that made a section more than 16 men in the same compartment. On the second to last day, Fitch appeared at Tommy's elbow during the afternoon check and walked with him through compartment 3C, without being asked and without particular explanation. He ran his hands along the welds in the way that was his habit, reading the metal with his palms. She's good, he said. She is, Tommy agreed. They stood for a moment in the compartment. Fitch had his coffee. He seemed to always have his coffee, regardless of hour or circumstance, a constant that Tommy had come to find obscurely comforting. You know what I like about this work, Fitch said, which was unexpected, because Fitch rarely volunteered what he liked about anything. Tommy waited. It's honest, Fitch said. The metal tells you what it is. It doesn't pretend. You put load on it. It tells you whether it can take the load. That's all. No, he made a gesture that encompassed everything outside the hull, all the complexity and opacity of the human world. None of that. Just load and capacity. Tommy thought about this. People are like that too, he said. Sometimes. Fitch looked at him. Yeah, he said. Sometimes. He finished his coffee. He went back to his station. Tommy stood in 3C and thought about load and capacity. He thought about the hatch frame in 3F, broken and reframed, stronger than before. He thought about Pritchard standing up. He thought about himself at the stern in the night watch, giving names to the ocean, and the ocean carrying them forward. He thought he understood something about the relationship between what breaks you and what remains that he had not had words for before this voyage, and that he still did not have perfect words for, but that lived in him now as knowledge rather than idea, which was a different and more reliable thing. The last night before arrival, Tommy stood the 0400 watch at his station, running the checks with hands that knew their work completely now. And when the checks were done, he stood at his board in the yellow light and let the ship be around him. He thought about the boy who had stood on a platform in Decatur and not known what his father meant. He thought he knew now, or knew better, knew enough. You know what you are. He was a man who paid attention, who wrote things down, who stood in the smoke and did the next thing, who kept names, who played chess badly and was getting better at losing, who stood at the stern of a ship in the middle of the Pacific at 0200 and gave names to the ocean and felt, underneath the fear and the exhaustion and the weight of everything difficult, something that was not happiness exactly, but was the thing happiness is made from, the sense of being present in your own life, fully occupying the space your life has given you. He was a man who was going home. Not yet. There was something between now and home that was real and serious and would require everything the last 2 months had built in him. He held this plainly, without minimizing it. He was afraid of it, which was correct. He was ready for it, which he believed. He was not ready enough, which was probably also true. But readiness was asymptotic. You approached it without arriving, and the approaching was the thing. He reached into his breast pocket. He took out the notebook. He wrote standing up, which he had never done before, the pen moving against the page that was lit by the damage control board's indicator lights, green and steady. Day 64. Last night. Tomorrow we arrive at whatever is next, which Beck says is larger than what came before, which I believe, which I am afraid of, which I am ready for. 3 of those things can be true at once. I have learned that ere. He paused. The ship moved under him. The board glowed. The section is ready. Not perfect. Beck says perfect is not the destination. Better is the direction. And better we are. Pritchard stood up. Vasquez knows the 3D board. Fitch is listening to the engines right now. 2 compartments over, reading load and capacity in the way that is his. Marsh will find something to appreciate about tomorrow's breakfast regardless of what tomorrow brings. And I have come to understand this is not naivety, but a form of wisdom I did not recognize because it did not look like wisdom from the outside. He stopped. Added, Gria and Soto. I say the names. He looked at the board for a moment. All green. Dad fixed the linoleum. Mom says come home. I have written it as a promise. Tomorrow I will begin the keeping of it. He closed the notebook. He put it in his breast pocket. He stood at his board in the yellow light of compartment 3D, in the deep middle of the USS Indiana, in the deep middle of the Pacific Ocean, and he breathed. The ship moved south and east through dark water. The engines held their note. The ocean held its silence. Tommy Morrow held his station. 3 days out had become tomorrow. Tomorrow was coming whether he was ready or not. He was ready. The battle lasted 6 hours and 40 minutes. Tommy would know this number precisely. Later. The way you know the measurements of rooms you have lived in, not because you have measured them deliberately, but because time, like space, leaves its dimensions in the body when the body has been inside something long enough, and 6 hours and 40 minutes of that particular kind of time makes a permanent impression. He would not describe the battle in detail, in the years after, not because he couldn't. Because the describing of it always felt like a reduction of it, the way describing a piece of music in words produces something that resembles the music without being it. The battle was the battle. It was noise and smoke and the board in 3D, and Vasquez at the hatch and Beck's voice on the intercom, steady as a fixed star, and the ship taking damage and giving damage and holding, always holding. And Tommy doing his work in the smoke and the dark and the concussion of the guns and the sounds the hull made when it was hurt. He did his work. The section held. The Indiana held. That was the shape of it. Everything else was detail. What he would describe, in the years after, when he described anything at all, was the moment the guns stopped. He had thought, after the first battle, that the silence was the most extraordinary thing, that comprehensive and resonant silence built from everything that had preceded it. He had thought he understood it. The silence after the second battle was different. Longer, perhaps, or felt longer. Deeper. The difference between a silence at the end of a storm and a silence at the end of a longer storm, not a different kind of silence, but a fuller one, shaped by more, holding more, requiring more of the men who stood inside it. Tommy stood at his board. All lights green except 2 3B and 3G, both flagged, both already attended to, both holding. He had been to both during the 6 hours and 40 minutes. He had done what needed to be done. His hands had done the things his training had put in them, and they had done them correctly, and the 2 compartments that had been threatened were holding. He looked at the board for a long time. Then he looked around at the men of his section. Vasquez, standing at the 3F hatch with his hands at his sides, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of a man reviewing something internal. Fitch, sitting on the deck with his back against the bulkhead, not listening to the engines now, just sitting, which was the first time Tommy had seen Fitch simply sit. Pritchard, standing at his station with his logbook open, writing, his pen moving across the page with a steadiness that was not the steadiness of before, not the careful steadiness of a man maintaining composure, but something that had come through the composure and out the other side into something more durable. Marsh, eating something. Nobody knew where it had come from. Nobody asked. Tommy looked at all of them. He looked at Beck, who was at the forward hatch, speaking quietly into the intercom, one hand on the frame of the hatch the way you put your hand on the shoulder of something you want to know is still there. Beck finished speaking. He put the intercom back. He turned and looked at the section. He looked at each man in turn, the slow and calibrating assessment. He said nothing. He did not need to. The Indiana left those waters 14 hours later. The departure was not triumphant. The Navy did not, in Tommy's experience, do triumphant. The ship turned on its heading and moved, which was what the ship always did, and the waters it left behind became, simply, waters it was no longer in. The distance accumulated. The horizon closed behind them. Tommy stood at the stern in his off-watch time and watched the ship's wake spreading out and fading into the flat gray surface of the sea. He stood there for a long time without thinking very much. In the particular empty state that follows the spending of everything, you have not peace, not yet, but the prerequisite of peace, the cleared space where it would eventually arrive. He thought about the linoleum. He thought about Thursday evenings. He thought about coffee that was not this coffee. He did not think about the 6 hours and 40 minutes. That was for later, for the longer work of understanding that would take months or years, that would arrive in pieces and not all at once, that would require the distance of time, the way certain things require the distance of miles, things that are too large to see clearly when you are inside them, but that become visible, slowly, as you move away. He would do that work. For now he stood at the stern and watched the wake and breathed the cold Pacific air, and felt the ship moving under him, still the Indiana, still her engines, still her particular way of meeting a long swell, and he let that be enough. The passage home took 23 days. Not straight home. The Indiana was a warship, not a ferry, and she moved on the Navy's schedule through the Navy's priorities, stopping where she was needed, turning when she was directed, arriving in Pearl Harbor on a gray Tuesday morning for resupply and repair before the final leg north and then east to the mainland. Tommy stood on the deck when they came into Pearl. He had heard about Pearl. Everyone had heard about Pearl. It was the wound the war had opened with, the morning that had changed everything. December 7th, a date that had become less a date than a dimension, a thing you move through rather than past. He had heard about it and read about it and listened to Vasquez's silence on the subject of it for 2 months, and none of that had prepared him for the sight of it from the water. The ships still in the harbor, or what remained of them. He stood at the rail and looked. He did not write about this. Some things were not for the notebook, not yet, maybe not ever. Some things you carried in a different way. Vasquez stood beside him. They stood for a long time, without speaking. Then Vasquez said, quietly, not to Tommy in particular but to the air between them, I was on the Maryland. Tommy did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not make it smaller. She survived, Vasquez said. Damaged. But she survived. He paused. A lot of things survived that weren't supposed to. He moved away from the rail and went below, and Tommy stood there alone for a while longer, looking at the harbor, at the gray water and the salvage and the evidence of everything that had been asked of this place and these men, and he understood, looking at it, something about the difference between a thing that breaks you and a thing that makes you, that the difference is not in the thing itself but in what the thing finds in you when it arrives, and what it leaves behind when it passes. They left Pearl 3 days later. north through warming water, then east, the ocean changing character with the latitude and the season, becoming something different from the vast gray indifference of the combat theater blue, calmer, a quality to the light that was not gentler exactly, but less severe, as though the ocean this far from the fighting had been told something it didn't know in the south. Tommy wrote every day, not the brief log entries of the earlier weeks, but longer pieces, following the thread of something he was beginning to understand about the last 2 months, and what they had made and unmade in him. He wrote about Beck. He wrote about Vasquez and the chess and the rosary and the 7 minutes in the smoke. He wrote about Marsh finding something to appreciate about every meal, which he now understood, as he had told the notebook in the Pacific night, was not naivety but a form of wisdom, the wisdom of a man who has decided, as a matter of discipline rather than disposition, to find the good thing, because the good thing is always there if you are willing to look for it, and the looking is a choice made again and again every morning. He wrote about Harold Greer and William Soto. He wrote about the linoleum. He wrote about his father's words on the platform in Decatur, and what he understood them to mean now, which was simply this, that there is a self that persists through difficulty without being destroyed by it, that meets what comes and does the necessary work and remains, afterward, recognizably itself. That his father had known this about Tommy. That Tommy had not known it yet. He knew it now. On the 18th day of the passage, Beck sat down across from Tommy in the mess hall after the evening meal and poured himself a coffee and sat with it and said nothing for a while, which was Beck's way of beginning a conversation. Tommy waited. "You're getting out," Beck said, eventually. Tommy had told no one this. He had barely told himself. But Beck had a way of knowing things that seemed to bypass the normal channels. "When my time is up," Tommy said. "Yes." Beck nodded. He drank his coffee with the reflective attention he gave most things. "Good," he said. Tommy looked at him. "A man like you," Beck said. "The Navy is not the destination. It's," he looked for the word, which was unusual. Beck rarely looking for words, material. "You're collecting material." Tommy sat with this. "For what?" he said. Beck looked at him with the assessment look. "The measuring." "You'll figure that out," he said. "You're the kind that does." He finished his coffee. He stood. He put the cup in the return. "You did good work, Morrow. The section did good work." "Yes," Beck said. "And you." He left. Tommy sat at the table for a long time after, his own coffee cooling, thinking about material and what it was for, thinking about the notebook in his breast pocket. 3 notebooks now, the first 2 filled and folded inside the breast pocket of his peacoat, the third 2/3 complete. Thinking about what collecting material meant and what you did with it when you had enough. He thought he might know. He thought it was going to take a long time and require a different kind of work, and that the work would be worth doing. He thought his mother would have something to say about it. He thought he was very much looking forward to hearing what she said. They came into San Francisco on a Thursday morning, thin fog, the Golden Gate emerging from the gray as the ship passed under it, enormous and red-orange above the water, the cables vanishing into cloud, the whole thing appearing and then being present and then being behind them as the ship moved through and into the bay, and the city opening out on all sides, gray and white and green on the hills, alive with its own uninterrupted life, its streetcars and its morning deliveries and its windows lit against the fog. Tommy was on deck. The whole ship was on deck, or close enough, men lining the rails, standing on every elevated surface that permitted standing. And the silence among them was not the silence of the ocean, not the silence of the spaces between battles. This was a different silence entirely. The silence of men looking at the country they had come back to, the country they had been carrying in the breast pocket, next to the notebook, for however many months, and finding it there, present, entirely itself, as though it had simply been waiting. Tommy stood at the port rail and watched the city come. He was not going to cry. He was fairly sure of this. And then the fog broke momentarily, and the sun came through at a low angle over the hills and struck the bay, and the water went gold, and the city went gold, and something happened in his chest that he did not attempt to name or manage, that he simply stood inside the way you stand inside a room that is briefly full of light. He stood inside it. He let it be what it was. There were procedures. After docking, there were always procedures, and Tommy followed them without impatience, because the procedures were the Navy's way, and he had made his peace with the Navy's way, had come even to value it, and besides the procedures were finite, and he could see the end of them, which made them easy. He said goodbye to men in the manner of men handshakes, brief direct eye contact, a few words that carried more than they said. Fitch shook his hand and said, "You're good at your job." Morrow and Tommy said, "So are you." Fitch and they looked at each other for a moment, and that was everything. Pritchard, whose boots were thoroughly scuffed now and whose face was entirely its adult self, shook his hand and said, "Thank you," and Tommy said, "You did it yourself," and Pritchard looked at him with the eyes of a man who understood what he was being given and accepted it. Marsh embraced him, which Tommy had not expected, a large and genuine embrace, and then stepped back and said, "The food on this ship has been exceptional, and I stand by that assessment." "You're a strange man, Marsh," Tommy said. "I know it," Marsh said, with complete happiness. Vasquez lost. They stood outside the gangway in the thin San Francisco morning, the fog still present but brightening. The city audible beyond the docks, the sound of a city, ordinary and continuous and extraordinary in its ordinariness. Vasquez extended his hand. Tommy took it. They held the handshake for a moment longer than handshakes usually last. "You'll be all right," Vasquez said. Not a question. Not reassurance. A statement of something he had assessed and found to be the case. "So will you," Tommy said. He believed this completely. Vasquez nodded. He walked away down the dock, his bag over his shoulder, his hands at his sides. He did not look back, which was simply how Vasquez was, and Tommy watched him go until the fog took him. Beck he did not say goodbye to formally. Beck was not a goodbye kind of man, and Tommy understood this. But as Tommy was collecting his things from the compartment for the last time, Beck appeared in the hatchway and stood there and said, "Safe travels, Morrow." "Thank you, Chief, for everything." Beck looked at him for a moment. "Thank me by being useful," he said. "In whatever comes next. That's the only currency I take." He moved away down the corridor. Tommy looked at the compartment for a moment, at the board with its indicator lights, at the hatch he had stood at for 6 months, at the overhead bracket that had been replaced. He looked at all of it. He picked up his bag. He went up through the ship, through the corridors and the ladders and the hatches. He knew the way. He knew the rooms of his parents' house, the shape of each one in the dock, up through the lower decks and the middle decks, and finally up through the last hatch into the open air. The San Francisco morning on his face, the smell of the city replacing the smell of oil and salt, and the particular close warmth of 1,900 men living in steel. He walked down the gangway. He put his feet on the ground. He stood for a moment on the dock and felt the extraordinary ordinary stillness of land, no movement, no swell, no deep engine hum translating up through the soles of his feet. Just the dock under him, just the city, just the morning. His legs expected the ship's motion and didn't find it, and kept expecting it, the way the body holds onto what it knows even after the knowing is no longer needed. He thought, "I will miss it." He thought, "I know what that means now." He walked toward the gate. The train from San Francisco to Decatur took 2 days. He had a window seat, which he had asked for and been given, and he sat at the window for most of the 2 days and watched the country move past the brown California hills, giving way to the Nevada desert, giving way to the gradual greening of the middle country, the land becoming flatter and more familiar, the sky opening out the way Midwestern skies do, the horizon dropping away on all sides as though the earth is breathing out. He slept better on the train than he had anywhere since Decatur. He wrote. He watched the country. He ate in the dining car, and the coffee was exactly as bad as he'd hoped it would be, and he drank 2 cups and was content. On the second morning, crossing Illinois, he got out his notebook, the third notebook, nearly full now, and opened it to the last page. He wrote, Day 87, Illinois, home in 4 hours. The land here is flat and familiar, and I did not know, before I left it, how much I had been shaped by the flatness, by the unobstructed sky, the long horizon, the particular quality of light in the middle of the country that is not like any other light. I know it now. The Pacific taught me what home looks like by being comprehensively not it. He looked out the window at the passing fields. I have been afraid. I have held a brace in smoke while the ship was hit and the lights flickered. I have said names to the ocean. I have played chess badly and lost the right way. I have watched men I did not know long enough become men I knew well enough to trust with my life and did. I have done my work. I have held my station. He paused. The train moved through a small town, a water tower, a grain elevator, a crossing with its gate down, a boy on a bicycle waiting, watching the train pass. I don't know what I am going to do with everything I have collected. Beck said I would figure it out. I believe him. He has been right about most things. I know this. Whatever it is, it will be honest. It will look clearly at what is difficult and say so. It will keep names. It will believe that the ordinary things, the linoleum, the kitchen, the Thursday radio, the coffee, are what everything else is made of. It will try to find the good thing, which Marsh has taught me is not naivety, but a discipline, a daily practice, a choice. It will try to be useful. That's the only currency Beck takes. He stopped writing. He looked at the notebook for a moment, this third one, and the 2 in his peacoat pocket, and everything in them. He closed it. He put it in his breast pocket with the others, over his heart, where it had lived for 3 months. The train arrived in Decatur at 3:47 in the afternoon. The platform was the same platform. The water tower with its faded lettering. The smell of the town grain and diesel and something green. The particular smell of an Illinois summer afternoon, warm and full and completely itself. His mother was on the platform. She was smaller than he remembered, which surprised him, and then did not surprise him, because the Pacific was very large and makes most things smaller by comparison. She was wearing the blue dress she wore on occasions, and her hands were clasped in front of her, and when she saw him come through the gate she unclasped them, and they went to her mouth for a moment before she lowered them and came toward him. He went toward her. They held each other on the platform for a long time without speaking, and there was nothing that needed to be said, and so nothing was said, and the sounds of the platform moved around them, a whistle, a cat, other people's voices, and none of it had anything to do with them, which was fine, which was exactly right. His father was at the car. He was a man of medium height and medium build, with hands that were large for the rest of him, the hands of a man who had always worked with them, and he was standing at the passenger's side of the car with his arms folded in the way he stood when he was trying to contain something he considered excessive. When Tommy came toward him, he unfolded his arms. They gripped hands. His father's grip. The same grip as the platform in Decatur 7 months ago, unchanged, the grip of a man who knew what his hands were for. "You look good," his father said. "You fixed the linoleum," Tommy said. His father looked at him. Something moved across his face that Tommy would think about later, not surprise, not confusion, but a kind of recognition. The recognition of a man who understands that the small things are not small, and that his son now understands this too. "Only took me 3 years," his father said. "Better late," Tommy said. His father almost smiled, which was, for his father, the equivalent of something expansive and joyful, and Tommy received it as such. They got in the car. The kitchen was the same. The light was the same, the late afternoon light coming through the window over the sink, the particular gold of an Illinois summer evening. The second shelf with the fig preserves. The radio on the counter, antenna tilted left for the 2 stations that needed persuading. The linoleum was smooth and flat at every corner, the back door corner newly fixed, the repair careful and even. Tommy stood in the kitchen and looked at it. His mother moved around him with the specific efficiency of a woman who has prepared for this coffee started. Something in the oven that smelled of the particular combination of his mother's kitchen and no other kitchen in the world. His father sat at the table with his hands around a cup and looked at his son and said nothing, which was his father's way of saying everything. Tommy sat down at the table. The coffee came. The evening came in through the window over the sink. The radio played something on the station that came in clearly without adjusting, something low and unhurried, and after a while his mother sat down across from him and his father refilled his cup, and outside the birds were doing whatever birds did in the Illinois summer evening, and the light moved on the wall and none of it asked anything of him. He was not the same man who had left this kitchen. He knew this without needing to name all the ways it was true. Some of them he could name, and would, in time. Some of them he would be discovering for years. Some of them lived in the body rather than the mind, and would only make themselves known when the body encountered the things that called them forward: loud sounds, smoke, the motion of water, the weight of a handshake held a moment longer than usual. He was not the same. He was, still, Tommy. He was, still, entirely himself, the self that had always been there, that his father had named on the platform, that the Pacific had tested and the ship had shaped and the men of Section 3 had witnessed. Present, functional, capable of the work, still the kind that writes things down, still the kind that keeps names, still the kind that stands at the stern in the dark and gives things to the ocean and believes, without entirely knowing why, that the ocean carries them forward. He put both hands around his coffee cup. He felt the warmth of it move into his palms. He sat in his mother's kitchen with the evening coming in and the radio playing and his father across the table saying nothing in his fullest way, and outside somewhere in the neighborhood a screen door opened and closed, and a car went by on the street, and the birds continued, and the light moved on the wall, and the linoleum lay flat and fixed at every corner, and Tommy Morrow was home. He breathed. Once. Twice. He closed his eyes. He let the kitchen hold him. And the evening deepened, slowly, without hurry, into night. This concludes the story. Sleep well. Good night.